Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Wildfire Solutions Coalition's webinar on the May revise of the governor's budget. We're glad that you all have been able to join us, and we're looking forward to diving into a little bit of the budget with you all. So in case this is your first time interfacing with the Wildfire Solutions Coalition, I'm very excited to tell you a little bit more about who we are. My name is Brooke Rose, and I am the coordinator for the Wildfire Solutions Coalition. And the goal of the coalition is to secure the long-term funding needed to fully implement California's wildfire resilience strategy. Our sort of ethos is that we have a plan, we know what works, and one of the biggest barriers to achieve wildfire resilience is the funding. The coalition launched in June of 2025, and in the course of just 11 short months, we've been able to grow to over 85 members. The coalition is truly a cross-sector statewide coalition. We have some of the usual suspects, a lot of nature conservancies, land trusts, folks in the recreation space, but we also want to bring in folks from the economic and business side, lots of water districts, public health, tribal members. Wildfire in California is something that affects everybody, and we really need an all of the above approach and make sure that everybody is included in our efforts to meet the state's needs. Our objectives for 2026 are kind of threefold. The first is to increase funding from California's Cap and Invest program, which is the only ongoing source of state funding for wildfire resilience. We also want to expedite Prop 4 appropriations, which is California's $10 billion climate bond. We've also been really focused on educating California's next wildfire governor. Since December, we've had the opportunity to meet with 5 or 6 of the leading gubernatorial candidates for California to ensure that whoever replaces Governor Newsom is a wildfire advocate and feels fully educated and ready to tackle the wildfire crisis in California. I am joined by 2 members of the coalition strategy and planning team, Michael Jared, Associate Director of External Affairs at the Nature Conservancy, and Emily Blackmer, Director of Government Affairs at Sierra Business Council. I will hand it over to Emily to give a little bit more background about the California budget.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm just going to kind of do the high level budget overview so that we're all kind of on the same page when we talk about the revise and wildfire resilience funding in the revise. I know folks kind of come to this work with varying levels of kind of um, varying levels of background on the state budget. So for some of you, this will be old news, and hopefully for others, it's kind of a helpful level set. So how does the state fund wildfire resilience? In recent years, there have been 3 primary funding sources that the state has relied on. The first is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That is a fund that is where cap and invest proceeds go, or one of the places that cap and invest proceeds go is to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And wildfire resilience has received $200 million from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund since 2018. The other, on an annual basis, I should say, $200 million every year. The other funding source are natural resource bonds. When we have them, most recently, voters passed Prop 4 in 2024, a $10 billion dollar climate bond that included funding for wildfire resilience. And then when times are good and the state is flush, we have also allocated some surplus from the state's general fund to wildfire resilience. Right now, the state is not as flush as it has been in previous years, so that general fund surplus is not kind of something that has been on the table so far. So we're primarily looking at the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Prop 4 right now. So a little background on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This is complicated. We're getting a little wonky here, so bear with me. Prior to last year, the state kind of allocated the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund on a percentage basis. So it said, this program gets 15%. This program gets 10%. Um, by and in large, that was the approach that it used. Last year, the legislature changed its process for allocating fund from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to this tiered system. Um, and switched from percentages to a flat amount. So the first tier is the bucket of programs that gets funded first. So that's kind of priority number one, and there are a handful of things in there. Um, Tier two is the bucket that gets funded second. That includes 1 billion on an ongoing basis every year for California's high-speed rail project, and then 1 billion on an ongoing basis for legislative priorities. So tier two gets funded second after tier one. And then there's tier three, which is all the programs that previously received kind of a certain amount from Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund every year. Those were the kind of the programs that received continuous appropriations. Now these programs are in the third priority tier. So if there's enough money after we fund tier one and enough money after we fund tier two, then tier three gets funded. If we're a little short when tier three, then everything gets a haircut across the board. And that's where we are right now. Next slide, please, Brooke. Or yeah, actually not next slide, just the advance. So this is tier three is where that 200 million for wildfire resilience lives. And if tier three gets cut, then that 200 million gets cut. And that's, as I said, that's where we are this year. Next slide, please. So that's the background on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, kind of where our baseline is that 200 million. Moving on to Prop 4. This is a breakdown of all the funding that Prop 4 allocated, that voters approved. And the bigger of the two light blue pie slices is wildfire resilience funding. The bond included just about $1.5 billion total for wildfire resilience funding. Next slide, please. Last year, the budget allocated almost 600 million from Prop 4 for wildfire. That was technically split across 2 fiscal years, but the upshot here is that so far we have spent just about 600 million of that 1.5 billion. Next slide, please. So in January, every year, the governor proposes a budget. And that's kind of the line in the sand for the budget hearings that the legislature holds, for the negotiations that occur between the legislature and the governor's office, kind of our starting point, our blueprint for the state's upcoming budget. Coming into 2026, the state's budget situation was not looking so good. In November, the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is the nonpartisan kind of advisory arm to the legislature, projected that the state would have an $18 billion deficit. The governor's budget proposal in January was not quite as conservative and identified an almost $3 billion deficit. So a fairly significant difference there in terms of the projected deficit, but both were projecting a deficit and both were projecting a multi-year deficit. One kind of key element that the legislature and the governor's office agreed on last year in response to that ongoing deficit was to borrow some money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and use it to shore up the general fund. So the legislature and the governor agreed, over the course of 3 years to say, hey, we have all this money in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The general fund is really short. We're going to take some of that Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and use it to pay for general fund obligations, specifically for CAL FIRE operations. So that's kind of subtract $750 million from the amount available in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Next slide, please, Brooke. So where's the coalition in all this? As Brooke noted at the beginning, we went into the year hoping that we might be able to scale funding for wildfire resilience from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, but looking at these deficit numbers and this multiple year deficit situation, we had to switch from offense to defense going into 2026. And so protecting that 200 million from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has been one of our top priorities for 2026. Basically saying we can't afford to go backwards on wildfire resilience funding. We need to at least stay level, um, not accounting for inflation. We won't even go there. We need to at least stay level with our 200 million. Um, Second, we were saying, hey, let's get Prop 4 money out the door promptly, especially given that, other state funding is under threat. The feds are pulling back funding. We have all these Prop 4 dollars that voters strongly approved. Let's get those out the door. So we were saying, let's get close to what we spent in Prop 4 last year. Last year we did about 600 million. Let's allocate 500 million from Prop 4 for wildfire resilience in 2026. So those are the two big funding priorities that the coalition has been focused on this year. And then the third one is pass AB 35 to ensure that Prop 4 funds can be granted expeditiously. This is more of a technical piece. The language in Prop 4 didn't include an exemption to California's Administrative Procedures Act that other natural resource bonds have included. So AB 35 would address kind of that discrepancy and ensure that this natural resource bond funding can be rolled out in the same way that previous natural resource bonds have been rolled out, and avoid any delays that grant-making agencies might otherwise encounter trying to comply with a regulatory process that they don't typically comply with, or that they aren't typically subject to, I should say. So where does that leave us as of January? This is kind of the summary slide. In total, if you look at this middle column, the January budget proposed 455 million for wildfire resilience, with 314 million of that coming from Prop 4. You'll notice that's a good bit short of the 500 million we were hoping for. And 141 million coming from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, again, a good bit short of that 200 million target. So all told, this budget represents a 43% decrease in wildfire resilience spending over the previous year, over 2025. And the coalition thinks that that's kind of moving us in the wrong direction. And we would like to see funding levels be more consistent, at least a smaller delta, and ideally over time increase. So that's kind of where we were until last week, and the governors may revise. And to take us into the revise and update this chart, I'll pass it over to Michael from the Nature Conservancy.
Thank you, Emily. That was a great background for us. And also thank you to Brooke for the introduction. Michael Jarrett with the Nature Conservancy. Can we move to the next slide, Brooke? Great. So last week, the governor released a May revise, which is done every year to refine projections on revenues and to create some changes in the governor's January budget. Typically, this is done after people pay their taxes so that there's a better picture of what the state's taking in, and it often includes new proposals that weren't considered in the January budget. As you can see from this slide, what was a deficit became additional revenues. The top three revenue sources for the state came in $16.5 billion more than the January projection. So there's a lot more revenue in the system, and the governor, with his May revise, proposes to essentially budget for budget year plus one, and to spread out this increase in revenues and then put some away in the rainy day fund and he also includes some new spending proposals for his initiatives. However, Prop 4, in the wildfire chapter, there was no additional funding from the $314 million that was included in the January budget. Um, this wasn't technically in the May revise, but it was announced the same day. So, and for the GGRF, the Department of Finance said that they were downgrading their revenue projections. So, the reason that the amount is cut from 200 to 144 in the January budget was because that was how much money they thought the greenhouse gas reduction fund would come in. And tier three gets a proportional reduction if there isn't enough revenues to fulfill their obligations after tier one and tier two has been fulfilled. And so they said there's going to be even less greenhouse gas reduction fund money. So they gave every item in tier three an additional haircut, which cut wildfire resilience funding by 37 million additional funds. And then, but at the same time, it retains the backfill for GGRF, both the 750 million, but there's also an additional 500 million that was committed last year. So a significant amount of money for CAL FIRE operations to be backfilled out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Can we go to the next slide? So if you take a look at this, this is the tier three allocations, and it shows an additional proportional reduction. So 200 million was what was set before and what we got last year. January came in and said 144 million. May revise says 105. So that's a significant decrease. But all of these other programs that are in tier three got the same percentage decrease. And so if you look at the bottom right number, that's $364 million, a reduction from what the tier three should be getting if there was enough sufficient GGRF. And I think it's important to compare that number to the backfills of CAL FIRE's operation budget and the governor's other budget proposals for greenhouse gas reduction fund spending. There are ways in which we can make tier three whole. Go to the next slide. So this gives a good, another view of this to show what I've just said. Can we go to the next slide? Yep. And then so looking at Prop 4, it shows last year, and then we're just kind of at level. Go to the next slide. And then, just looking at this year versus last year, I think the issue is, this is both bad for work done on the ground, but it's also bad for a capacity on the ground. It's not CAL FIRE does some of this work itself, and other state agencies do some of this work themselves. But in a lot of instances, these are grants that go out to organizations. And so if there's a roller coaster of funding down, it harms their ability to be ready to do more funding, do more work in the future, because they just won't have the capacity. Let's go to the next slide. And so this graph shows that really if this was approved, we would be at the lowest amount since the 2019 budget. So this is a real reduction of the trend that we saw of a sort of bigger amount from that 2020 year through last year. And I think it's a helpful sort of comparison. And then I think it's also important to show that how stable GGRF has been. Organizations have really been able to count on it, and I think it allows the state to do multi-year planning. It allows for projects that will take more than a couple years to do. And so I think it's really important to keep that stable funding going into the future. Next slide. So our asks remain unchanged. And we believe that there are ways to make the 200 million whole. And that, with the sort of additional general fund revenues, we think that this should be a priority and that the 200 million should be restored for this year. In addition, we feel that we shouldn't be reducing Prop 4 funding amounts. We need to sort of be on a steady clip to spend that as well. And we think there especially, there are some categories that are well oversubscribed within Prop 4 that could use additional funding. And then from AB 35, while as a result of the advocacy of a lot of the people on this webinar, AB 107 did grant administrative procedures exemption for all the Prop 4 funding that has been appropriated to date. It didn't cover future years and wouldn't cover this next appropriation. And so AB 35 is still important and will be heard in its Senate Policy Committee next month, where we will support it. Next slide. And this is just some of, I think all of you are going to be doing advocacy, and I think it's important to say that we think, I think that there's a belief that cutting wildfire resilience saves money for the state. And in a short-term sense, that could be true. But when you look at the sort of impacts of these wildfires, it actually costs the state a huge amount of money to backpedal on wildfire resilience. That every high severity wildfire that destroys communities and natural resources that happens, and it causes incredible economic losses, incredible suppression response costs, and also incredible disaster response and restoration costs and recovery costs. So that it's not really saving the state any money in the long term. It's actually costing money. And there was a good study that came out that showed that the U.S. Forest Service believes that every dollar they spend in wildfire resilience saves $6 to $7 in suppression costs. So this is really, I think, short-sighted to reduce these funds at this point. Next slide. And this shows what's at stake. We believe that wildfire resilience or the wildfire crisis is a huge affordability driver. It's the number one expense that utilities are spending on is wildfire ignition reduction. And so when we do the larger landscape scale fuel reduction work, we also reduce the damages of these fires, which reduce pressures on insurance costs, utility costs, various other costs. Costs of housing. It's very expensive to have to rebuild housing stock every year that was destroyed in wildfire. We think we make a really good affordability argument. In addition, public health, the smoke, and other damages that wildfires cause to people's health is severe. And there was actually a study from Stanford that showed that 14 people died from the LA wildfires, in addition to the deaths that happened because of the fires, just from smoke inhalation. And that sort of feeds into air quality. And then the carbon emissions. I think a lot of people have pointed out correctly that these really high, we've always had wildfires in the state, and some degree of wildfire smoke should be in our baseline. But these mega fires are completely abnormal and unheard of. And so those have a huge carbon implication. And then ecosystem resilience. I mean, we've lost 20% of our old growth sequoia trees from high severity wildfires. The last time we lost 20% of those trees, we started the National Park Service. This is really important for not just all of the human impacts, but the impacts to iconic parts of California. Next slide. And then there's also incredible benefits to investing in this work, both in, as a public health measure, the cost savings, and so the flip side of the affordability argument. Also, this is a great way to put a lot of people to work, doing this work out in the forests or, in their communities, doing the defensible space work, home hardening work, and then the fuel reduction prescribed fire work. And water security. I mean, it's not good for our reservoirs. It's not good for our water supply to have these really high severity wildfires. And then we also believe that it's a really cost-effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by doing wildfire resilience work. Next slide. So this is the timeline, the budget timeline, and I think this is part of why we're having this webinar is we've reached a really critical juncture in our budget advocacy. The January budget is released. We just had the May revise. The budget subcommittees met to discuss the May revise proposals, and they're going to kind of go into a black box. and something is going to emerge on June 15th. In the past, it's been a two-party agreement between the legislatures, the two houses of the legislatures, and then the governor has created a sort of subsequent agreement with them that has been acted before the new fiscal year of July 1st. Um, However, they could, in theory, defer Prop 4 and GGRF until after they come back from summer recess. So while it is true a budget is due by June 15th and the new fiscal year is July 1st, last year they deferred on those two items and handled them after summer recess towards the end of session. So really, our advocacy from now uh, until either June 15th or until August 31st, somewhere between there, is going to be most pivotal because I think that people will respond to pressure and to really good arguments on why these investments are important. Next slide. All right, we're moving to the Q&A. I think I got through that pretty quick, so hopefully people understand what occurred in the May revise.